Good day, everyone. Welcome to the MMPI-3 Overview webinar. Before turning to the presentation, I'd like to offer a disclosure of my financial interest in the instrument. I am a paid consultant to the MMPI publisher, the University of Minnesota Press, and distributor Pearson, and I receive research funding from the University of Minnesota Press. As co-author of the MMPI-2RF and MMPI-3, I receive royalties on sales of test materials and scorings. With that, a brief description of our agenda for today. It's a full agenda, so we'll be going relatively quickly, but as Sherry just mentioned, you will get a copy, a handout with the slides after the presentation. So I'll begin with a brief history of the MMPI instruments to place the MMPI-3 within that historical context. We'll then talk about the goals for the MMPI-3, the process of developing the test. Then I'll be describing the MMPI-3 scales and norms, and then we'll conclude with the manuals, user's guides, and software-based reports. As I said, we have quite a bit of material to get through, but we will leave some time at the end for question and answer, and if need be, we'll be able to go a little bit past the top of the hour. With that, we'll begin with our brief MMPI history. The instrument was first published in its final form in 1943. Authors Stark Hathaway and Charlie McKinley developed the original MMPI with the goal of having a differential diagnostic indicator that could be given to University of Minnesota hospital patients and indicate in a very direct manner whether a patient had one or more of the 8 most commonly occurring psychiatric disorders then treated at the facility. And those were represented by the 8 original clinical scales. The test did not succeed as originally intended. It was not possible to use it directly as a differential diagnostic indicator because the clinical scales lacked sufficient specificity, and as a result, the false positive rate would have been too high if interpreted as intended. However, instead, an alternative approach was developed, led by Hathaway and one of his students, graduate students at the time of the development of the MMPI, Paul Meehl. The code types came to be the primary purpose or use of interpreting the original MMPI, and this was developed as an empirically based system for classifying individuals into code types and developing empirically grounded descriptions and predictions on the basis of the empirical correlates of the code types. Validity scales, of course, also played a very important role in allowing the test taker, the test interpreter, to appraise the quality of the information provided by each test taker through the validity scales. A large number of supplementary measures were eventually introduced for the original MMPI as well, sometimes to help clarify the somewhat diffuse picture that emerged from the clinical scale code types. And the norms of the original MMPI represented the population of the state of Minnesota in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The MMPI-2 was published in 1989. A primary purpose for the MMPI-2 was to update and expand the test norms. The MMPI-2 norms that were collected during the 1980s were collected nationally in order to provide a nationally representative sample of the population of the United States. Obviously, the original norms from the late 30s and early 40s were no longer adequate to represent the population of the United States in the 1980s. Clinical scales were essentially left intact in the revision, and that was done to maintain continuity with the code types so that they could be interpreted on the basis of the literature that accumulated with the original MMPI. New items were introduced through a set of content scales, and this was possible because not all of the original MMPI items were scored on the basic validity and clinical scales, so items that were not used were replaced with new items that were included on the content scales that were introduced in 1989. Some new validity scales also were introduced. In spite of the fact that this was a relatively conservative update, there was some initial skepticism expressed, particularly about whether the code types, in fact, could be interpreted with the MMPI-2 norms using original MMPI research. Those concerns were alleviated fairly rapidly, and indeed the MMPI-2 was relatively quickly accepted as a replacement for the original MMPI. This brings us to the MMPI-2RF. which was introduced in 2008, co-developed by Alka Tellegen of the University of Minnesota and myself. Alka is, of course, also a co-author of the MMPI-3. Our overall objective, as indicated in this slide, was to represent the clinically significant substance of the MMPI-2 item pool with a comprehensive set of psychometrically adequate measures, first and foremost to address some of the psychometric shortcomings of the original clinical scales that had long been discussed in the literature and recognized. We believe that if we were to succeed in this process, we would wind up with a more efficient instrument, both in terms of length. We didn't think we would need all 567 MMPI-2 items. Some of the original clinical scales were quite a bit longer than they needed to be in order to achieve adequate reliability and validity, but also improve efficiency on the interpretation side of things and make the interpretation of the MMPI more straightforward than the rather cumbersome process of interpreting MMPI-2 code types, subscales, supplementary scales, and so forth. We also believe that we would and sought to enhance the construct validity of the MMPI by linking the scales of the restructured form, the MMPI-2RF, to current concepts and models in the field of personality and psychopathology, so as to allow for construct validity-based interpretation in addition to empirical correlates. The strategy involved first restructuring the clinical scales. This was a process that was initiated actually in the early 1990s by Alka Tellegen, whose picture you see here in this slide. Tellegen began working on restructuring the clinical scales shortly after the MMPI-2 was introduced. I joined him in this process a little bit later on, and eventually in 2003, the restructured clinical scales were added to the MMPI-2. We then augmented those RC scales with the measures that were needed to achieve a comprehensive assessment, as the RC scales were not designed to measure and assess everything that could be assessed with the MMPI-2 item pool. The outcome then, as mentioned, was the MMPI-2RF that included 338 items, all of which were part of the MMPI-2. So it was a subset of the MMPI-2 item pool scored on 51 scales, 9 validity scales, 42 substantive scales. We continued to use the 1980s norms for the MMPI-2RF, so the same norms that were collected in the mid-1980s for the MMPI-2 were used with the restructured form as well, the only change being that we moved to using non-gendered rather than gender-based norms for the MMPI-2RF. At this point, we have now well over 450 peer-reviewed publications on the restructured form, so it's gotten quite a bit of attention in the peer-reviewed literature as well. Now, two needs that were not addressed with the MMPI-2RF included the need to expand the item pool, as I mentioned earlier, restricted the MMPI-2RF to the existing MMPI-2 item pool. We were not able to address any needs for updating the item content of the instrument to address more contemporary issues. As just discussed, we did not update the test norms. And those indeed were the two primary goals for the MMPI-3, was to enhance the content of the instrument and collect and update the norms for the test. The norms that are used with the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-2RF are now well over 30 years old. There have been a lot of changes in the population during that time period, both demographic and experiential. At the time that the MMPI-2 and RF norms were collected, it's safe to assume that no members of that normative sample had ever heard of, let alone used the internet or social media. So clearly, we live in a different milieu, and there was a need to update the norms both demographically and to represent the current experiences of the population. In terms of the development process itself, the test was primary vehicle for collecting data to update the test and develop the MMPI-3 was the MMPI-2RF-EX, which stands for expanded. So we used an expanded version of the restructured form as the starting point. This EX booklet, as we call it, included a brief biographical questionnaire, the 338 MMPI-2RF items, 43 of which were updated to include, to simplify the language and deal with some of the awkward language that was left over from the MMPI-2. We also developed some trial items. All of this work, by the way, is described in detail in the technical manual that I'll be mentioning briefly lately, including some preliminary studies that we did to develop the revised items and the 95 trial items and a booklet and an answer sheet. And importantly, QLocalEX, this was a version of Pearson's scoring and test administration software, QLocal, that Pearson developed specifically for this project of developing the MMPI-3. QLocalEX allowed our field sites to administer the expanded booklet and score the MMPI-2RF. So this allowed us to collect data that were actually used in assessments in which the MMPI-2RF was administered and interpreted. All of the material was also translated into Spanish by Tony Puente and his team at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. They translated all of the new items and the rewritten items and any other material that was used for the data collection. And the starting point was the MMPI-2RF translation by Garcia and Azan. And then Dr. Puente and his team translated all the new and revised items, as I mentioned, and we'll talk about briefly a little bit later in the presentation. Data collection included three primary types of data: field data. These were sites representing settings in which the MMPI is used, including mental health, medical, forensic, and public safety settings. These data were used for scale development and separate data for validation and also for developing comparison groups for the MMPI-3. We collected extensive data from college students at various sites. These data were used for some initial psychometric analyses and later for detailed validation analyses, and then normative data that I'll be talking about here shortly as well. Field data collection is still ongoing. At this point, we've collected, you can see the numbers here in this slide, over 16,000 individuals have been tested at the various field sites, data collection sites, and we also accumulated data on over 8,000 college students at various universities. For the normative data collection, individuals were tested in English twice for retest purposes, Spanish twice for retest purposes, and also a bilingual sample. And altogether, we tested to date approximately 28,000 individuals whose data were available for developing the MMPI-3 and will be available for subsequent peer-reviewed research as well. In terms of the process of developing the test, again, this is described in detail in the technical manual. But using the field data, we first began by shortening the RC scales to make them no longer than they needed to be in order to maintain their reliability and validity. We did add some items to some of the RC scales to expand the content for some at that point as well. For some of the specific problem scales of the MMPI-2RF, those were lengthened and expanded, and new ones were introduced that I'll discuss here shortly. And then the higher order and Psi-5 scales were updated to address any items that were deleted from the MMPI-2RF and incorporate new ones added to the MMPI-3. The validity scales were also updated, and I'll talk briefly about that as I go through the scales. Importantly, using both the normative and bilingual Spanish language samples that were collected, all rewritten and new items that were selected for inclusion on the MMPI-3 were examined to make sure that they also worked properly in Spanish. One item was dropped at that point, but all the remaining items that were added to the MMPI-3 worked adequately both in English and in Spanish. That was one of the requirements. In terms of outcome, 5 new scales added to the MMPI-3, beyond the MMPI-2RF, which was the starting point. These include a new validity scale, combined response inconsistency, and then substantive scales focusing on eating concerns, compulsivity, impulsivity, and self-importance, which is a measure of grandiosity. In terms of modifications, several scales went through some fairly extensive modification. The anxiety scale was substantially enhanced and expanded to cover what are now called anxiety-related experiences. Stress and worry scale was divided into two separate measures of stress and worry, and interpersonal passivity was converted by reverse keying to a measure of dominance. And then several scales were dropped in order to make room for new items for the MMPI-3, including gastrointestinal and head pain complaints, although some of those items were retained on the somatic complaint scale. And then multiple specific fears and the two interest scales were dropped again to make room for new item content. Altogether, we wound up adding 72 of the 95 trial items to the MMPI-3, dropping 75 MMPI-2 items for a total of 335 items on the MMPI-3. You can see the breakdown in terms of original MMPI-2 and new MMPI-3 items. The reading level remains the same as it was on the MMPI-2 of 4.5 on the Flesch-Kincaid readability index. That's grade 4.5. Overall, we wound up with 52 scales for the MMPI-3, 10 validity scales, one new scale being the CRIN scale, and then 3 higher order scales, 8 restructured clinical scales. One of the 9 restructured clinical scales was moved to the specific problems profile, and I'll go over that here shortly. And then 26 specific problem scales with several subsets, and then updated versions of the Psi-5, and I'll be going through each of these scale sets here next. So we'll begin with the validity scales. For those who are familiar with the MMPI-2 validity scales, so you can see that they're the same with the addition of the first combined response inconsistency scale, CRIN. The combined response inconsistency scale basically includes all of the VRIN and TRIN items, VRIN focusing on variable inconsistent responding in either the true or the false direction, whereas TRIN focuses on fixed inconsistent responding in either the true or the false fixed inconsistent responding. Those two together are now combined in the CRIN scale, giving us an overall indication of the level of inconsistent responding to the test. The overreporting scales, the 3 frequency scales, FFP and FS, were updated based on frequency counts of item responses with the current data sets, as opposed to the data sets that were used to develop these scales for the restructured form. So basically updating and finding the most infrequent, those items that are most infrequently answered in the key direction. FBS and RBS are unchanged on the MMPI-3. They're exactly the same items as are scored on the MMPI-2 And L and K were also updated with current samples to, again, find items that best reflect the uncommon virtues and likely reports of good psychological adjustment in clinical settings that are assessed with the L and the K scale. The substantive scales begin with our higher order scales. For those who are not familiar with the structure of the MMPI-2 we have 3 levels of measurement. At the broadest level, we have the 3 higher order scales listed here that tell us whether and to what extent the test taker is presenting with difficulties in the problem, in the domains, of mood and affect, as assessed by the emotional internalizing dysfunction scale. Disordered thinking as assessed by the thought dysfunction scale, and behavioral externalizing dysfunction, which assesses and indicates the extent of difficulties associated with under-controlled behavior. These 3 higher order scales, again, give us the big picture indication of whether a test taker is likely to be experiencing multiple problems, and of course, in either of these or any of these domains. And of course, more than one of them can be elevated, indicating a broad set of difficulties in more than one of the 3 broad domains assessed with the MMPI-3. The restructured clinical scales, as I mentioned, were updated for the MMPI-3. We don't have time to go into each of them in detail. They're described in detail in the Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation of the MMPI-3. But I will point out that the one scale that's missing from this list that did appear on the MMPI-2 RC scale list is RC3, the cynicism scale. That scale has been moved to the externalizing scales, and I'll talk about that briefly when we get to the externalizing specific problem scales. Otherwise, the 8 remaining RC scales assess the same constructs representing major distinctive core components of the original clinical scales of the MMPI and the MMPI-2. Of the RC scales, the one that has been updated the most is RC6, and what we did there was to add some items that are not quite as extreme as most of the items that appeared on RC6 of the MMPI-2 restructured form. Turning to the specific problem scales, these are the scales that give us the most narrow focus on specific areas of dysfunction, beginning with scales in the somatic and cognitive domains. The new scale in this group is eating concerns. Malaise is the scale that gives us an overall indication of the extent to which a test taker presents as being or perceiving themselves as being physically debilitated and being in poor health. Neurological complaints, as described here, focuses on complaints related to vague neurological symptoms. Eating concerns, these would be problematic eating behaviors. Items here include both binging and purging and other problematic eating behaviors. And cognitive complaints focusing on complaints related to memory difficulties and other aspects of cognitive functioning. The internalizing scales are divided into 2 subsets. The first subset are related to the demoralization domain, and these include our measure of suicidal death ideation, helplessness, hopelessness, self-doubt, which is our measure of low self-esteem on the MMPI-3, and inefficacy. The titles or labels for these scales, I think, are fairly self-explanatory in terms of what they focus on. The remaining internalizing scales are related to negative emotionality or dysfunctional negative emotions, RC7. And as you can see here, and as I mentioned earlier, the stress and worry scales are now separate measures, stress focusing on problems related to experiencing stress and general nervousness, whereas worry focuses on excessive preoccupation, rumination, and worry. The new compulsivity scale focuses on engaging in compulsive behaviors, checking and other, and difficulties refraining from engaging in these compulsive behaviors. Anxiety-related experiences now covers multiple anxiety features, including catastrophizing as a way of thinking, panic, experiences of panic, dread, and intrusive ideation. It remains the scale on the MMPI-3 that is most directly related to features of post-traumatic stress disorder. Anger proneness focuses on the affective experience of anger and being easily irritated and impatient with others, and behavior-restricting fears are fears that significantly limit and inhibit the individual's range of behavior. Turning next to our externalizing scales, the family problem scale is now included among the externalizing scales for the MMPI-3, along with juvenile conduct problems, substance abuse, and our new scale, impulsivity, that focuses on impulsive behaviors and difficulties controlling one's impulses. Activation focuses on a heightened level of energy and excitation, and overactivation. Aggression and cynicism focus on more antagonistic features of externalizing behaviors, and cynicism was moved to the externalizing profile in order to assess that more antagonistic feature of external, or add to the assessment of antagonism as part of an externalizing behavioral pattern. There is an appendix in the MMPI-3 technical manual that provides both an explanation and empirical data to support this decision to place cynicism within the externalizing scales. Among the interpersonal scales of the MMPI-3, we have our new self-importance scale. This is a scale that taps into beliefs that the individual has about having very special talents and abilities. The dominance scale is a reversal of the previous interpersonal passivity scale, as I mentioned earlier. And then we have the 3 scales focusing on interpersonal relationships, disaffiliativeness. People who score high on this scale generally dislike others and have no interest in being around them. Social avoidance, Individuals who score high on this scale tend to avoid social situations, not because they're not interested necessarily, but because they don't enjoy them, although they may be comfortable interacting socially with one or two close friends. And then the shyness scale, which focuses on social anxiety. People who score high on this scale feel awkward, anxious, and embarrassed when interacting with other people. And finally, we have our Sci-5 scales. These are updated versions of the personality psychopathology 5 scales that were first introduced in the 1990s for the MMPI-2, based on a model of personality disorder-related psychopathology that was previously developed by Al Harkness and John McNulty from the University of Tulsa. Harkness and McNulty updated the MMPI-2 Sci-5 scales for the restructured form, and now have done so again for the MMPI-3. For those who are familiar with the alternative model of personality disorder in Section 3 of the DSM-5, that model is essentially the same as the Sci-5 model, derived differently, but came up with a very similar dimensional model of personality disorder-related psychopathology, and that, of course, is the primary application of the Sci-5 scales of the MMPI-3 as well. Turning next to the norms for the MMPI-3, a little bit of information about how they were collected. They were collected by a company that was hired with particular expertise in collecting national samples and focusing on difficult-to-reach populations. Eureka Facts, the data were collected beginning in September 2017 through December 2018. The company recruited individuals through a number of different media, including social media, newspaper ads, word of mouth, and screened thousands of individuals by phone in order to identify individuals who would meet our demographic targets that we had provided for the normative sample. As we saw earlier, over 3,000 individuals were tested. All of these individuals were tested in person in prearranged locations, monitored and supervised by Eureka Facts personnel, and they were paid, the test takers were paid $50 per session, so those who came back for the retest were paid another $50. Approximately 98% of the test takers were tested by computer. If they weren't tested by computer, it was because typically there was a internet connectivity problem at the site at the time. One of the advantages of doing the data collection in this way was that we had immediate access to all of the data and were able to monitor and make sure that indeed we were meeting our demographic goals for the sample. The English language normative sample was selected to approximate projections for the 2020 census that were available already at the time of the data collection for race, education, and age. We wound up with a final sample of 1,620 individuals, 810 men, 810 women, and as we did with the restructured form on the MMPI-3, we use non-gender T-scores, although it is possible to compare test takers' results with just the men or just the women of the normative sample via the comparison groups that we have for the MMPI-3. This slide gives the locations where the data were collected throughout the U.S. I won't go through and read all the locations, but you can see that we targeted different regions of the country, and again, all of these were done in person with Eureka Facts staff, collecting data usually at hotels that where they rented conference room space. Sometimes they went into specialized locations when we were trying to reach particularly difficult to reach populations. In terms of demographics, again, we don't have time to go into this in detail, but just to give you some of the highlights, what this slide shows you, and this comes from the technical manual, is a comparison of the proportions of different races and ethnicities for the MMPI-3 normative sample, the 2020 census projections, and also the MMPI-2RF normative sample, which of course was also the MMPI-2 normative sample. The biggest difference you can see when you look down the row that says white was that for the MMPI-2 and RF normative sample, we had almost 82% white. For the MMPI-3, we are at 60.3% white, which is a little bit below the 2020 census projections, but certainly consistent with where the trend lines are going. The other big difference is moving from the 1980 sample, where there were only 2.9% individuals of Hispanic origin. We have 14% for the MMPI-3 normative sample, individuals of Hispanic origin. That's a little bit lower than the 2020 census projection of 16.8%, but recall that we have, and we'll get to it shortly, a separate sample for Spanish speakers. So these are all individuals who were sufficiently proficient in English, and probably overrepresents the proportion at this point of individuals of Hispanic origin in the U.S. adults who are proficient in English. The age comparisons, we were fairly successful in meeting our targets for the 2020 census, a little bit under projections for the 80-plus range, but that also is consistent with fewer individuals, a smaller proportion of individuals in that age group actually being tested with MMPI-3 or MMPI instruments, I should say. And then in terms of education, one of our goals was to increase the representation of those with less than a high school education, which was only 5% for the MMPI-2 and the RF. Normative samples were up to 8.6%, still a little bit below the projections for 2020, but again consistent with a lower proportion of individuals with less than a high school education who are actually tested with the MMPI instruments, otherwise fairly close match to the 2020 census projections. Of course, a very important question is whether the norms have changed for the MMPI-3, and if so, to what extent. We can get a very direct sense of that by plotting the scores of the MMPI-3 normative sample on the MMPI-2 RF norms, which is what you see here in this slide. If the MMPI-3 normative sample produced scores that are the same as the MMPI-2 RF normative sample, what we would be looking for and finding would be means of 50 and standard deviations of 10. So to the extent that the means here are different from 50, that represents mean score differences between the MMPI-2 RF and the MMPI-3 normative samples. And to the extent that the standard deviations are different from 10, that would represent different levels of variability. We can see here, and I'll have a summary slide that gives the details here shortly, but basically for the infrequency scales and for L, we do see some differences, about a 5 to 6 t-score point mean score difference. We're also seeing some differences across normative samples on the higher order and restructured clinical scales, also a fairly significant gender difference with men scoring higher than women on behavioral externalizing dysfunction and RC4, which is antisocial behavior. With the somatic cognitive and the internalizing scales, we see definitely higher levels of somatic reporting, somatic symptom reporting, or general complaints about poor physical health with a higher score on the Malaise scale. That's actually the largest difference between the two normative samples is the Malaise scale score. The internalizing scales are fairly similar across normative samples, and a little bit higher scores for the men on the externalizing scales. And you can see here also the results for the interpersonal and interest scales. Again, we're looking here at MMPI-2 RF scales, which we, of course, could score both the RF and the MMPI-3 from the expanded booklet that was used to collect all of these data. So to summarize, the largest differences in terms of validity scales, the short answer to the question of the norms changed is yes, and the largest difference in terms of validity scales are 5 to 6 point differences on the means for FR, FS, and FESR. However, some of these differences are offset, as indicated here, by larger standard deviations, meaning that the actual MMPI-3 scores won't be quite as discrepant. Nevertheless, T-scores are going to be lower on the updated and renormed F, FBS for women, and L scales. In terms of the substantive scales, we see 6 to 8 T-score point differences for men on behavioral externalizing dysfunction, women on RC1. Again, no need to read all of the information on the slide, but the T-scores are going to be particularly noteworthy. Changes are going to be lower T-scores on the updated and renormed somatization scales of the MMPI-3. Turning to the Spanish language norms, which will be available for the Spanish translation of the MMPI-3 when the test is released. Now what we're looking at here, excuse me, is the normative sample, the Spanish language normative sample plotted on the English language norms. So again, and these are MMPI-3 scores now. To the extent that the two normative samples scored the same, we would find means of 50 and standard deviations of 10. Any deviation from those two values indicates a difference between the Spanish language and English language normative samples. Here on the validity scales, we see differences particularly on FP and on L, and we see lower scores on the higher order behavioral externalizing dysfunction scale, and for women in particular on RC4, quite a bit higher scores on behavior restricting fears for both men and women in the Spanish language normative sample, lower scores on malaise, fairly comparable externalizing and interpersonal scale scores across the two normative samples, and again, lower scores on the disconstraint scale for the Spanish language normative sample. Overall, most means fall within 5 T-score points of each other, with some noteworthy exceptions. The L scale, we do see 10 T-score point higher scores for the Spanish language normative sample on the English language norms. Of course, when scored with the Spanish language normative sample, this difference will not appear. And then we see some lower scores as described here on the externalizing scales and on malaise, and higher scores on behavior restricting fears. There is somewhat reduced variability in the Spanish language normative samples, but overall, clearly separate norms are needed and will be available for the Spanish language version of the MMPI-3. Finally, turning to our manuals and users guides that will be available to guide use of the instrument, beginning with the manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation. This manual will include the usual information, a discussion of user qualifications, a description of the normative sample, standard procedures for administration and scoring of the MMPI-3, and comprehensive interpretive guidelines in Chapter 5 of the Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation. We provide very comprehensive interpretive guidelines. Everything you need to interpret the MMPI-3 will be included among those guidelines, as well as several cases illustrating application of these guidelines. And then the appendix material will include the usual scoring keys, T-score conversions, and some information at the item level, including reading level for each of the MMPI-3 items. This is the cover for the technical manual for the MMPI-3. You can see that we list a number of individuals who made significant contributions to the manual, including Martin Selbaum and Anthony Terascavage, each of whom wrote one of the appendixes in the to the MMPI-3 development process, or to the technical manual itself. As I mentioned earlier, this is where you'll find information about development of the MMPI-3, as well as psychometric findings, reliability data, standard errors of measurement for each of the 52 MMPI-3 scales in different populations or settings, and then very extensive empirical correlates. This is Appendix D of the technical manual, includes empirical correlates in mental health, medical, forensic, and public safety settings. This is the actual index to the tables of Appendix D. You can see we have 144 tables of empirical correlates, a total of almost 38,000 validity coefficients in the Appendix D of the technical manual. These were the data that we relied on in updating the interpretive guidelines for the MMPI-3 and developing interpretive guidelines for the new scales added to the MMPI-3. There's also a separate appendix, Appendix E, in which we compare correlates across versions of the test. So because we're able, with the expanded booklet, to score for each individual both the MMPI-2RF and the MMPI-3, what we were able to do in Appendix E is compare the correlations between scores on the different versions of the scales, RF versus 3, across the same settings, mental health, medical, forensic, and public safety settings. And here we have nearly 39,000 correlations where we compare the empirical correlates of scales, whether the RF versions of the scales or the MMPI-3 versions of the scales. And basically what we find is that they're essentially interchangeable. The correlates are the same whether you score the RF or the MMPI-3 versions, and that in turn means that MMPI-2RF findings apply to MMPI-3 versions of MMPI-2RF scales, which in turn means that the findings reported in the technical manual of the restructured form and the over 450 peer-reviewed publications that have appeared to date on the restructured form, those findings can be applied to interpreting scales carried over from the MMPI-2RF to the MMPI-3, and that will, of course, help support the empirical foundations of the MMPI-3 beyond the empirical correlates in Appendix D of the technical manual. We also have comparison groups in Appendix F. There will be 20 comparison groups for the English language MMPI-3 when it's released, and these are the 20 available comparison groups for the MMPI-3. And you can see at the bottom there also is a separate comparison group based on the normative sample of the Spanish language normative sample that is as well. As was the case with the restructured form, we will be adding comparison groups. Some of the data collection is still ongoing. Some of it, unfortunately, had to be suspended in March as a result of the pandemic. But these comparison groups are available with release, at the release of the test. And as I mentioned, we will be adding comparison groups as we go along. So there will be ongoing data collection. And then one final point about the comparison groups, it is possible, will be possible, to create your own custom comparison groups with data that you collect and accumulate with the MMPI-3. The manual supplement for the Spanish language translation, the U.S. Spanish language translation, is co-authored with Tony Puente, who I mentioned earlier was our collaborator on updating and developing the MMPI-3 for Spanish language speakers. This manual supplement includes information about the translation, the development of the Spanish language translation, the norms, reliability, and validity data, as well as some best practices for using the Spanish language translation and making decisions about whether to administer the test in Spanish or English to people who are bilingual. All of that is covered in this manual supplement. When the MMPI-3 is released, we also will have a French-Canadian booklet. We don't have separate norms for the French-Canadian booklet, but it will be available, as was the case for the MMPI-2RF, to use with French speakers in Canada. And then this is the cover for the user's guide for reports, both the clinical and both the score report and the clinical interpretive report. This is what our MMPI-3 score report looks like. It will include, of course, separate validity scale profiles, and then our substantive scale profiles include the higher order NRC scales, the somatic cognitive and the internalizing scales, the externalizing and interpersonal scales, and the Psi-5 scales, and then a summary page that organizes all 52 scales on one page, following the structure that we recommend applying to an interpretation of MMPI-3 scores as described in the Manual for Administration Scoring and Interpretation. Item level information will include a list of any unscorable responses. What you see here in this slide is the item numbers and content have been redacted to maintain test security. And for some reason, my slides just jumped, but I think I can find where we were before. It was right here. Here. So again, the item content has been redacted, but it will appear. Still trying to find my place here. Sorry. It will appear in the actual reports. Any unscorable responses, critical responses. These are items on scales that that Tellegen and I have identified as having critical content. And then turning to the interpretive report, it includes all the information of the score report and in addition a computer-generated interpretation. The summary page, profile pages look the same, so I've skipped to the summary page. In the interpretive report includes the highlights here. The bold indicates any scale that's actually interpreted in the report, which begins with a synopsis, a summary of the main findings, an analysis of the validity of the protocol, including the impact of unscorable responses on the validity scales, in this case the F scale, and then interpretation of scores on the substantive scales. I've highlighted or blown up here so you can see that every statement in the interpretive report is followed by a superscripted number. These are linked to endnotes that we'll see in a moment. Then continuing with the interpretation of scores in the different domains, a list of diagnostic considerations and treatment considerations, item level data, and then these are the endnotes to tell you for every statement in the report, whether it's based on content, item content, or test responses, empirical correlates, or as an inference of the report authors. Any statement that's identified as being based on empirical correlates will include reference numbers, and these are the research references that will be listed at the end of the report that support the statement. And the highlights here indicate hyperlinks. If you're looking at this report on a computer screen, you can click on the hyperlink. It will take you to the abstract for any article that is cited in the report. And again, most of these at this point, of course, are going to be MMPI-2RF publications. There are some customization options, particularly selection of comparison groups and item level information. If you use any of our comparison groups, you can plot the test taker's results along with the mean and standard deviation for the comparison group and get an indication not only of how the test taker's responses or scores compare with the normative sample, but also a sample of individuals tested in a similar setting or under similar circumstances. And then for the item level information, we get the customization provides the comparison group item response frequencies, as well as the option to select item level information, produce item level information for any of the scales, not just the ones that we designated as critical, but any of the scales of the MMPI-3 can be included as part of the customization of the report. The user's guide also provides information on interfacing with Pearson software to generate the reports and take advantage of the customization options. There's a separate user's guide for the police candidate interpretive report, which we're not focusing on here today. This is a report written by, developed by Dave Corey and myself, and I'm sure Dave will be providing separate webinars on use of the police candidate interpretive report. So with that, we've gone through the slides, and I see we do have some time left for our question and answer session, and if need be, I'm happy to go a little bit past the top of the hour for those who can stay. And so let me see if any questions have come in through the chat box.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben-Porath. So much information, and yes, of course, we have lots and lots of questions. We've been kind of trying to group them in terms of general scales, norms, questions about MMPI-2 and 2RF, if those will be retired, how long it's acceptable to use. Maybe that's the first place to start. We have had a lot of those relating to whether or not it's acceptable to continue using the 2 or the 2RF for a bit, and how long they may be available.
Okay, so I guess the one important piece of information I did not provide is when the MMPI-3 is scheduled for release. It's scheduled for release this fall, and at this point we're on target for a September release. The decision about the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2RF will be made by the publisher. That's not an author decision. That's a publisher decision, the University of Minnesota Press. And in anticipation of that question, I asked the press for a statement, which they provided, and I will read verbatim. It says as follows: there are no plans at this time to discontinue the MMPI-2 or MMPI-2RF, but the MMPI-3 is intended to be a replacement version of the test. Publisher of the MMPI, the University of Minnesota Press, strongly encourages all users to transition to the new version of the test owing to its up-to-date normative samples and enhanced coverage of clinically relevant content.
Thank you. How about a norms question? We have a lot of questions relating to whether or not there are non-gendered norms available, or if that was part of the consideration of the development of the 3.
Do you mean transgender norms for transgender individuals? There were individuals.
So
go ahead.
I was just going to say we have questions relating to both transgender and non-binary.
Yeah, so we did not ask people specifically to provide gender identities or identification. There are separate data collection projects ongoing with transgender populations and other non-binary individuals, but that was not part of the normative data collection for the MMPI-3.
Okay, we have questions about which test would be better currently, I think, for a forensic setting, the 2RF or the 3. So maybe some comparison there.
So that, of course, will be relevant when the MMPI-3 is released in September. In forensic settings, obviously, there are considerations in terms of potential challenges to using newer versions of tests. We do have extensive validation data from forensic settings, and as I mentioned earlier, the data from on the empirical correlates of the MMPI-2RF can be applied to the interpretation of the MMPI-3 scores in forensic settings. So there is no reason why the MMPI-3 could not be used in forensic settings. I think there will be a period where forensic psychologists may feel that they want to test the waters or wait and see, and others will go ahead and use it right away. Again, the publisher is not indicating that one test should or should not be used in any given setting. But we will have plenty of information available to guide forensic use of the MMPI-3, including specialized training webinars and other. I'll be providing a workshop for the American Academy of Forensic Psychology in September on forensic applications of the MMPI-3. So I think as soon as someone feels up to speed and comfortable using the test, there's no impediment for its use in forensic settings.
Yes, thank you, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean currently. I meant at publication, so which is how you answered. Thank you. How about translations? A couple of questions about whether or not the MMPI-3 is being translated into several specific languages, Korean, Mandarin, and then maybe you went through the Spanish version.
Yeah, so there is a U.S. Spanish version that already will be available upon release. It will be released at the same time. There are several ongoing translation projects at the MMPI-3. None of them will be done. None of them will be done at the time that the MMPI-3 is released, but the Korean group is already working on a translation. There's a translation ongoing in Japan and several other translations as well. I'm not aware of any work in the Mandarin language specifically.
So then somebody's asked about, could you comment about the use of MMPI-3 outside of the USA in terms of validity normative data?
Well, in English-speaking countries, I think the MMPI-3 can be used just as the MMPI-2 RF and before it the MMPI-2 and original MMPI could be used. None of the other English language-speaking countries, I believe, have developed their own separate norms. That's not to say that that couldn't be done at some point, but currently it would be just the same as any other version of the test being used in English-speaking countries.
I have a couple of questions about whether the manual is going to contain interpretations of code types and whether the MMPI-3 uses code types in the same way that the two do.
The short answer is no. The MMPI-3 does not use code types. The MMPI-2 RF also did not use code types. The code type classification approach, which is more of a categorical approach, was something that was developed very early on, as I mentioned, in the history of the MMPI to help address some of the shortcomings of the original clinical scales. But in general, the assessment of an understanding of personality and psychopathology focuses more on dimensional constructs at this point. And that's the approach that we use with the MMPI-3. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't get the same information that was obtainable via the code types from the MMPI-3 substantive scales. You can, but this does not involve actually classifying profiles, continuous scores into discontinuous discrete code types.
Thank you. I have a question from a professor teaching grad students adult assessment, asking if you currently have a text that you can recommend for students or clinicians to aid with interpretation of the MMPI-3.
So there will be an update to my book on interpreting the MMPI-2 RF, but it will not be available upon release. Martin Selbum and I are updating the book for the MMPI-3. At this point, when the test is released, the primary source, this is also true when the MMPI-2 RF was released, will be the manual. The manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation will include extensive interpretive guidelines. We will have resources available to instructors, slides. There will be various instructional materials available, as well as some self-directed study material available as well. So there will be other types of material available, but as far as textbooks are concerned, I think it'll be at least a year post-release before textbooks will be available.
And I've heard you also add to that how much interpretive information is actually included in the manual, how thoroughly that's covered.
Yeah, everything that's needed to interpret the MMPI-3 is included in the manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation.
So a few more questions about norms. Does the manual contain a comparison score and cutoff scores for forensic populations, such as child custody litigants, on the validity scales?
We do not have a child custody litigant comparison group at this time for the MMPI-3. That's one of the groups that we will be adding in the future.
Okay, thanks. I think that was also a question, if that was going to be added in the future. What about a normative group on seminary applicants? Similar question.
We do not have a seminary applicant comparison group for the MMPI-3. There was one available for the MMPI-2 RF, but again, we will be adding these groups as they become available.
Any plans to collect norms from other countries? You may have answered that a few minutes ago. I'm sorry if you did. When you
other countries. will be doing translations, and anytime a translation is done, they do collect, in fact, I don't think I mentioned this, but it's an important point, they do collect, that's part of the translation and adaptation process, is the collection of normative data in the country where the translation is carried out.
Okay, is there a breakdown of ethnic background of Spanish version or sites where norms were obtained? So, for example, Puerto Rico, Mexico, El Salvador, or were they grouped?
Yeah, all of the Spanish language data were collected in the U.S. The manual supplement it does include information about countries of origin of the Spanish speakers, the U.S. Spanish speakers. That information, both in terms of countries of origin and where in the U.S. the data were collected, is included in the manual supplement for the Spanish language version.
Okay, and then another person is asking if that Hispanic sample endorsed any specific items differently from white or other ethnic group counterparts.
So that was reflected in those normative comparisons that I showed earlier, and the short answer is yes, there are some normative differences, which is why we have separate norms for the two language versions of the test.
And a question about the samples were selected from big urban cities. How about people from rural areas, such as farmers in small towns? They're wondering if the sample represents more big. Yeah, go.
Yeah, we did for that reason. One of the reasons was that we did go into West Virginia to collect some data, and in some of the locations we were able to recruit individuals who lived in more rural communities. But probably the most rural would have been the West Virginia sample.
Okay, I'm going to move to some scale questions now. I have a whole bunch, and they're pretty specific. Just kind of start walking through them. Will religious clients have a somewhat elevated L scale like the MMPI and MMPI-2?
There's no reason to think that the L scale will function differently on the MMPI-3 than it does on the RF, the MMPI-2 RF, or did on the MMPI-2 or original MMPI. It's a measure of uncommon virtues, and people who are raised in very traditional homes to aspire to some of these virtues do score above average on L. There's some research showing that usually can account for about 5 T-score points, so anything greater than that cannot be attributed. Any deviation from the norm more than 5 T-score points cannot be attributed to religious background.
Thank you. Any clinical or supplemental scales that highlight sexual predators or sexual dysfunction? So we do have a comparison group of individuals who are assessed at intake to men test at intake to a sexual addiction treatment program, and there are some data included in some of the validation studies looking at sex offenders, but there are no scores that are unique or specific to identification of either sexual deviation or sex offenders. We can certainly assess personality and psychopathology functioning in those populations, but there aren't scales that can be used, and perhaps that wasn't the question, but we don't have the ability with any psychological test to identify someone specifically as having particular sexual offending proclivities. Does the compulsivity screen for sexual compulsion? Does compulsivity screen for sexual?
It's not specific to sexual compulsion, no.
I have a question about what is the difference between some of the interpersonal scales: disaffiliativeness, social avoidance, and shyness. Those three.
So disaffiliativeness, one way to think about this is that each of them can be linked to, and not uniquely to one disorder and only one disorder, but disaffiliativeness, people who score high on that scale will tend to have more features associated with schizoid personality, a lack of interest in human contact. Social avoidance is more closely related to features of avoidant personality disorder, and shyness is more closely related to features of social anxiety disorder, what used to be called a social phobia.
Thank you. Is the self-importance more closely related to narcissism or schizo-dimension?
What was the second one?
Narcissism or schizo-dimension?
It's more closely related to narcissism, and specifically to the grandiose features of narcissism. But it's not unique to narcissism. So grandiosity can, of course, also be found in people who are experiencing hypomania or mania. But there is some research that was recently presented and will soon be published showing that in terms of features of narcissism, the self-importance scale taps into the grandiose features of narcissism, whereas the self-doubt scale taps more into the vulnerable features of narcissism.
Okay, thank you. How related are the cynicism and disaffiliativeness scales?
So disaffiliativeness has to do with a lack of interest in social interaction. Cynicism has to do with a misanthropic view of others as being untrustworthy, and a general suspiciousness of the motives of others. Scores are correlated on those two scales. We have intercorrelations in the technical manual that can give us the specific information about that, and those are obviously things that can co-occur, cynicism and disaffiliativeness, but they're very distinct constructs on the other hand.
What is the relationship, or is there a relationship between disaffiliativeness and a diagnosis of autism?
There's really not a whole lot of work on that particular question, so I don't think we have any empirical data that we can turn to. What the somewhat limited work that has been done is not focused or not shown disaffiliativeness to be particularly elevated in individuals with autism-related problems. That has shown up more on some of the other scales, the social avoidance and the low positive emotions RC2 scale.
Are there any scales or combinations of scales that might address ADHD, combined type, inattentive type, and or hyperactive impulsive?
So again, we don't, because the impulsivity scale is new and has new items that were added to the MMPI-3. This is one area where we can't rely on the MMPI-3, MMPI-2RF literature. We did have some of the criteria that were available for the analyses for the MMPI-3 included features of hyperactivity, but not specific breakdown such as the one that was just mentioned. The impulsivity scale is associated, and we do also find correlations with disconstraint and activation. But at this point, we don't have enough new and unique or specific data that allows us to make that kind of a more fine-tuned breakdown. I think as data are accumulated, we will be able to learn more about that and probably further refine use of those scales for that purpose.
Could you expound a little more on the benefit of having the overall CRIN score instead of just using BRIN and TRIM?
Yeah, the BRIN scale tells us the extent to which people provide inconsistent responses in the opposite direction, one false, the other true. The TRIN scale tells us the extent to which people provide inconsistent responses that are either both true or both false. The CRIN scale basically takes all of the inconsistencies into account. And we run some initial analyses, and also one of my former students, Danielle Burchett, and her group at California State Monterey Bay have run some analyses that will be published in the not-too-distant future showing that CRIN really helps further identify problematic protocols. Basically, what we want to do with these three inconsistency scales is make sure that people are able to understand read, comprehend, and respond relevantly to the test items. And CRIN essentially gives us another way of identifying excessive, inconsistent responding that could lead to reduced validity of the substantive scale scores.
What was the rationale for reverse scoring the interpersonal passivity scale to the dominant scale?
So that was done in part in order to facilitate focus on more antagonistic personality features, and some of the rationale for that is described in one of the appendixes of the technical manual, the one that was written by Martin Selbaum, and so I would refer anyone interested in those details to Appendix B of the technical manual. I should add that this is an important caveat. It's still possible, it was always possible to identify dominance with the interpersonal passivity scale in the form of low scores on interpersonal passivity, and the opposite will be true on the MMPI-3. People who score below 39, T-score 38 and lower on the dominant scale will be individuals who were previously identified as scoring high on interpersonal passivity. So we're still able to assess for that. We've just reversed the keying on the scale.
Okay. And someone has asked why there are no higher order scales for somatic and interpersonal dysfunction.
The higher order scales were developed on the basis of a factor analysis of the RC scales that showed that those are the three broadest domains in terms of psychopathology. It's also consistent, I think, with findings in other analyses that look at hierarchical models of psychopathology. They don't aggregate to the same level as do these higher order domains. So those would be the primary reasons.
I'm going to read a question, part of which you responded to earlier, or another question but similar, but so that you can hear the whole question and then respond to the rest. Often extremely religious individuals produce elevations on scale L and occasionally scale 8. Was this addressed in MMPI-3?
So again, there will be moderate elevations for people who are very religious on L scale, but that once you get into scores that are in the interpretable range, 65, certainly 70, and above on L, a religious or traditional background alone is unlikely to generate that kind of elevation. I don't think it's as likely to show up on RC8 as it was on original clinical scale 8. And on certainly the original MMPI that included some specific religious belief items. So I don't think that's going to be a confound for interpreting RC8.
Is the brood item omitted?
The brood item is gone. You will no longer be asked, what does brood mean?
The next question is ARX, anxiety-related experiences, which you noted includes an aspect of catastrophizing. Is that sufficient to evaluate catastrophizing as maladaptive coping in spine surgery and spinal cord stimulator patients? Can it be incorporated into Dr. Block's algorithm?
The short answer is yes. We actually have some data on that in the technical manual, some data with spine surgery candidates from Dr. Block's sample. He will be updating the algorithm to include the MMPI-3 items. He and I will be updating the spine reports that are available presently for the MMPI-2RF. But catastrophizing is also still going to be associated with other scales as it is on the MMPI-2RF. So it's not just the anxiety-related experiences. For example, demoralization also is correlated with catastrophizing.
Will the interpretation of MMPI-3 scales that are unchanged from MMPI-2RF remain unchanged? the interpretation?
Yeah, the interpretation will mainly remain unchanged unless we identify additional empirical correlates in the new analyses that are included in Appendix D. But certainly for the two validity scales, FBS and RBS, that are unchanged, the only difference will be some of the T-scores will change with the new norms, and those changes have been incorporated in the cutoffs that are included in the MMPI-3 Manual for Administration, Scoring, and Interpretation for all of the scales.
Thank you. The RF has some scales with as few as 4 items. How small, what number of items, are the MMPI-3 scales with the fewest items?
I think the one with the fewest items is eating concerns, and it has 5 items. Most other scales have at least 7, if not all other scales have at least 7 items, if memory serves correctly. That's one of our goals for the MMPI-3, was for some of the scales that had a smaller number of items on the RF to write some additional items and expand those scales, and that's been done.
Thank you. Was the intent of CRIN to give a more precise cutoff for invalidity when VRIN and TRIN are both marginally elevated?
So I wouldn't put it that way, but I think that is actually a good example. There are cases where you can get scores in, let's say, 75 plus range on VRIN and TRIN, so neither one of them is technically invalid, and there will be cases where CRIN is elevated above 80, indicating invalidity, where both VRIN and TRIN are less than 80. So it does assist in identifying invalid protocols beyond what VRIN and TRIN can identify on their own.
Okay, thank you. Can you comment about the modification from the passivity scale to the dominant scale?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that was done in part to line up the dominant scale with the more antagonistic features of externalizing personality disorder-related problems. But as I mentioned, it's still possible to identify individuals who are passive and dependent in interpersonal relationships. These individuals will now score below 39 on the dominant scale.
Sorry, that actually wasn't the question I intended to ask, since you had already spoken to that. Here's another one about the dominant scale. Is the new dominant scale related to interpersonal circumplex concepts? If so, is there anything similar to a warmth scale for interpretation?
It is. We don't have any data specific to the MMPI-3, but there was a study looking specifically at the circumplex and the scales of the MMPI-2RF. And based on that, and also just understanding the concepts and constructs, it would be related to the dominance dimension. In terms of warmth, that tends to be low scores on some of the scales, particularly a low score on social avoidance, which would be associated with extroversion and gregariousness, and a low score on RC2 as well.
Thank you. There is a male inmate normative group. Will there be a female inmate normative group?
Yes, we are in the process of collecting data. That was one of our projects that got unfortunately suspended, but we will be adding a female inmate comparison group as well.
Thank you. Do you have performance validity correlates or classification statistics with RBS, the response bias scale?
Yes, there is, in fact, some data on that. Those data will be published in a journal article that will be submitted in the not-too-distant future. Again, RBS on the MMPI-3 is the same in composition as the RBS on the MMPI-2RF, so it functions essentially the same. The only difference are some of the T-score values, and that's been incorporated in the interpretive guidelines in the Manual for Administration Scoring and Interpretation. But we do have data with performance validity. One of my students recently defended her dissertation looking specifically at that with the MMPI-3, Jessica Tyliki, and she will be submitting a paper for publication with that information.
Thank you. What scales are correlated with diagnoses of PTSD?
I mentioned, I think, during the presentation that the scale that's most strongly correlated with various features of PTSD is the anxiety-related experiences scale. But we also see correlations with demoralization, of course, and with RC7, the dysfunctional negative emotions RC scale. And then there are, for individuals who experience significant dissociative symptoms along with PTSD, we sometimes see that reflected in elevations on RC8, the aberrant experiences RC scale.
Thank you. Do you have performance-based neuropsychological correlates for the cognitive complaints? Sorry, for the COG scale. I'm assuming as with the OR.
Correct. So the cognitive complaints scale is not intended to correlate with actual cognitive performance test scores, and it doesn't, especially once you remove invalid protocols. It really does focus on cognitive complaints per se rather than cognitive functioning, and that's true for the MMPI-3 as it was for the MMPI-2RF.
Are the 10 main clinical scales still being used in the MMPI-3?
The original clinical scales were not carried over to the MMPI-2RF, nor are they carried over to the MMPI-3. Those scales, particularly, of course, the 8 original clinical scales were developed in the late 1930s, early 1940s, using what were then state-of-the-art techniques, technology, and knowledge about psychopathology. But we've learned quite a bit about both psychopathology and personality, improved our test construction techniques since then, and are no longer needing to do all of our analyses by hand, paper and pencil, as was the case for the original clinical scales. So no, the restructured clinical scales assess the major distinctive components of the original clinical scales, and other important features assessed with the original clinical scales can be now assessed with additional specific problem scales, Psi-5 scales, and the higher order scales of the MMPI-3.
Thank you. We'll try 1 or 2 more questions, and then we're going to need to wrap up and answer the rest of these in a frequently asked questions document that will be made available later. So, will validity configurations be interpretable?
Yes, they are, and there are recommendations for looking at scales across the validity scale profile. We don't have configurations as was the case with the original validity scales or the validity scales of the original MMPI, but it's absolutely the case that the interpretation of scores on the validity scales is integrative. For example, the F and FP scales focus on different manifestations of infrequent responding that may have different implications, particularly when working with populations with severe psychopathology. So that will be the case with the MMPI-3 as well.
Thank you. We'll try 1 more. Are there scales that you would recommend when looking at parenting capacity on the MMPI-3?
So we don't have a parental fitness comparison group at this point for the MMPI-3. We did for the RF, and we will be adding that for the MMPI-3. But what I would say more broadly about that is that the MMPI-3 is really a construct-based instrument. So if someone is doing a parenting capacity evaluation and you know what the potential personality and psychopathology challenges are that you are assessing for, and that might adversely impact parental capacity, then you're able to assess for those personality and psychopathology features with the MMPI-3. We don't have scales that tell us this is a good parent or a bad parent, which of course we also don't have for any other version of the MMPI. But just as we were able to use the MMPI to identify potential challenges to parenting based on personality and psychopathology findings with other versions of the MMPI, we'll be able to do the same with the MMPI-3 using the expanded content and, of course, importantly, the up-to-date norms for the test.
Okay, yes, I'm going to ask one more, and that is, off the top of your head, can you remember which other psychological tests the manual will include the correlations for with the MMPI?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Anne-Marie.
I'm sorry. Does the manual have correlations with other psychological tests such as PAI, MCMI, NEO, etc.? That's the question.
There are correlations with the PAI in the MMPI-3 technical manual. I don't think we have correlations with any of the other tests that you mentioned, but we do have correlations with a lot of other measures, particularly using our comprehensive correlate data with the college students. So take a look at Appendix D. There are a lot of other measures, not omnibus measures other than the PAI, but a lot of other measures of narcissism and depression and emotional functioning or dysfunction, all included in the correlates in the technical manual.
Well, thank you, and thank you again for spending your time with us, Dr. Ben-Porath, and for all of you who were able to participate today and spend time learning about the MMPI-3, which we're really excited about. You heard a lot of information about it today. Please be sure to check our webpage and the UPress's webpage for additional information on future training opportunities and additional test information. We'll close.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thanks everyone for attending today. Bye-bye.